Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nick Shalom. We're going to get started in about 10, 12 minutes. In the next episode of A Nick of Time, we're going to have a great guest today, Armon, joining us as the co-founder and CTO of HashiCorp, innovating in so many different fields, of course, with zero trust, key management, and service mesh. So stay tuned. We're going to get started in about 12 minutes. In the meantime, if you want to share, you here, put your name and your company in the comment section so we can highlight you on the screen. Also, if you want to be added to the wait list of the new platform we're launching, which is really a private community of learning for DevSecOps and digital transformation and cyber. Learn with Nick. You want to be added to that wait list to become a member. Make sure you shoot us an email at info@preventbreach.com so we can add you to the wait list. The launch is going to be, end of August, so stay tuned for that as well. In the meantime, don't forget to start thinking of questions. If you have a question, always start with a Q so we know it's a question. Stay tuned. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nick Shalom. Thanks so much for joining the next episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes now with Armon joining us, of course, from HashiCorp as the co-founder and CTO. We'll talk about service mesh and identity management, key management, and of course, we'll never forget about Terraform and the orchestration of GitOps and infrastructure as code today. So it's going to be a lot of fun, a lot of great topics on how to innovate, how to move at a pace of relevance, how to enable that agility so you can create innovation while having that baked-in security in the process. And we'll even cover Policy as Code with their new product, Sentinel, as well. So stay tuned. If you have questions about any of that stuff, make sure you start with a Q in the comment section below. Also, if you want to share you here, just put your name in the comment section so we can highlight you on the screen. And then finally, if you want to be added to the wait list for the launch of the new Learn with Nick platform, we're going to be launching by the end of the month. We're almost at capacity. It's really a private community, but it's also the ability to learn with new videos every week and 45 segments on digital transformation, DevSecOps, and cyber, including, of course, Zero Trust. So if you want to be part of that new community and subscription-based learning, self-learning environment with also a full community and live Q&A sessions with me as well, make sure you subscribe now before we are at capacity. So stay tuned. We're going to get started about 5 minutes. And if you want to subscribe to Learn with Nick, make sure you send us an email at info@preventbreach.com. All right, 5 minutes, maybe 4 minutes now. We'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nick Chalon. Thanks so much for joining this next episode of In the Nick of Time. We're very lucky today. We have an amazing guest, Armon, joining us today from HashiCorp, one of the co-founder and CTO. We'll talk about so many interesting subjects, might be actually too many, but that's okay. It's always fun to be able to dig into technologies like Service Mesh and Zero Trust and infrastructure as code, GitOps, and policy as code, and so many other things. So it's going to be a lot of fun today. As a reminder, if you have not done so yet, please subscribe to the show on the website here, in the nickoftime.tv, so we can send you notifications about the next guests. Next week, we're going to have Joy Aurora, who is the former Air Force and Platform One officer, now working at the Outpost to help companies get access to government funding and be able to do business with the DoD. So that's going to be also very interesting, deep dive on how to actually do that, how to also make the next billion-dollar companies that will be able to compete against some of the traditional DoD primes. So stay tuned next Tuesday, 1 p.m. For the next episode with Joey as well. Also wanted to remind everybody we're going to be launching the Learn with Nick platform by the end of the month. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to have not only a 45 video segment, a ton of content already created on digital transformation, cyber, of course, DevSecOps, Kubernetes, Service Mesh. And it's really also designed for non-technical teams, so they can also keep up and be able to learn enough to be dangerous. So stay tuned for that. If you want to become a subscription members, you can do that by emailing us to get early access when we launch. We're going to be capping the number of members. So if you want to be part of that list, send an email at info.preventbreach.com. Also, you'll see that we have a community, private community there to be able to share lessons learned. We have so many companies in telcos and banks and healthcare and, of course, defense and governments with NATO partners and, of course, the United States. So I think it's going to be a very interesting place to share lessons learned and what's working with large organizations struggling to adopt the DevSecOps. So if you want to become a member, do that now before we're out of seats. And then, like I said, we have a pretty amazing guest today. I'm pretty excited. We worked together in the past when I was in the department. But before I bring him on, I'm going to share with you a little bit of kind of what he's been doing. Of course, he co-founded and he's the CTO of HashiCorp. And he has a real passion for cyber and distributed system. But what you're going to see also is someone that's able to take really state-of-the-art research, like academic research, and turn it into actual products, not just a bunch of things sitting on a shelf in a lab, but actual products, and tying that back to the open source community, and of course bring this as a fully fledged capability rapidly. And they've been able to innovate in so many different fields, from products like Terraform, Vagrant, Sentinel, of course Consul, and so many others. So we'll be able to talk about a lot of different subjects today. So we're going to bring Armon on now. Good afternoon, good morning. Good to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here, Nick.
Yeah, I was so excited because, you're one of the kind of the few people I know that have such a breadth of expertise. I think you're pretty much touching every aspect of kind of digital transformation, DevSecOps, agility, with so many different products. We had a tough time when we prepped this episode together to kind of narrow it down to something that people will be able to understand. But it's so many exciting subjects. I was always pushing because I felt like we wanted to cover everything. So it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. First, of course, for people that want to follow you, you're mostly on Twitter, but you have of course a LinkedIn account like everybody else. But you're pretty active on and you have a pretty cool handle. So most people don't get the 5-letter handles any longer. So for people that want to follow you, of course, check out his Twitter. But then I'm gonna let you, like I always do, give a little bit of your background first before we start digging into the real meat.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. In some sense, it kind of goes back to my time at university. I knew kind of going in, I kind of, even as a kid, had sort of a passion for programming computers. I probably started with Visual Basic when I was like, 11 or 12 or so. So going into university, I knew I wanted to study computer science, and went in and very quickly realized like I had a sort of passion for distributed computing and sort of the security challenges around it. And I fell into a bit of a research project at the University of Washington, really focused kind of early days of kind of cloud. This is like 2006, 7, where it was like Amazon was just being born, right? Like EC2 and S3 were brand new services. And really looking at like, hey, how do you build applications in this sort of a modern cloud environment where you don't control the network? It's actually early days of EC2. You don't even have a private network. It's this shared multi-tenant, like random other people could be in your subnet. And so we were really cutting our teeth on like, how do you build applications in that space where it's like the network's sort of fundamentally not trusted, things are highly ephemeral, they're coming and going. And that's where I met my co-founder, Mitchell Hashimoto. He was on the same research project. And so we spent our time at university sort of cutting our teeth on some of those problems. I ended up actually interning at AWS, and so kind of got to see how the sausage is made on the inside. And then we sort of, ended up in industry working at a mobile ad tech business for a few years, realized that all of these problems around how do you, build and scale cloud applications, how do you deal with security, how do you deal with service discovery, were unsolved, right? Like it wasn't just an academic problem that we saw in university, it was a commercial problem that we saw in industry as well. And so ultimately that led us to start HashiCorp and say, okay, great, someone should just build a set of solutions using kind of that state of the art to solve these different problems rather than every organization kind of having to, build the wheel. And that was back in 2012. So it's been about 10 years since then. Hard to believe, time kind of flies by. In the meantime, we've gone from 2 people in my living room to we're well over 2,000 employees now. From a suite of open source products as well as sort of commercial offering, cloud offering, and we did our IPO last year. So it's been a long but fun journey, and it still feels like there's a lot of work ahead in terms of making security easy to use and making cloud easy to use. But it's been fun.
I did not realize that you were 2,000 people. I knew you were obviously past the, the startups. I don't even know how we count startup versus large organization anymore. But for an IT company to be 2,000 is really a kind of a pretty big achievement when you look back and you remember the early days. What lessons or what kind of advice would you give yourself, back in 2012? Regarding kind of your growth and kind of raising money versus making money through sales. Like what was kind of a big lessons learned for you going all the way through an IPO?
Yeah, I'm chuckling because I feel like I could write a book on all the
You should.
I think probably the biggest was, I think we were just really, naive is the right word to use, right? We were naive when we started the business in the sense that we didn't really have a business model. We didn't know who our target customer was. We didn't really know how we were going to monetize anything that we were
Make
doing.
money.
Yeah, we had no idea about any of that stuff. So we were kind of naive. We went into it, we're like, we'll just build open source and we'll kind of figure it out as we go.
Yeah. Typical tech guys, I gotta say.
Exactly,
I'm
yeah.
one too, right? So
Exactly.
marketing and sales comes after, right? Yeah.
But I think the mistake of that was that we ended up building a lot of products that we shouldn't have in retrospect. We ended up having to kill them, and so it was a waste of time. And then we wasted a bunch of time going after certain customers that later on we realized weren't actually our target customer to begin with. So I think to me, the most important lesson is, if I could go back, it would be like, define our business plan and define our target customer at the beginning, because that clarifies what products to build, how to sell, who to sell to. And it would have saved us a lot of pain and suffering along the way. That's probably
how big is I guess your target customer now? You can pretty much tap any business, right? Small business, large enterprise. It's pretty much across all verticals, right? So nowadays it's like it's just everything.
Yeah, I think, and now obviously it's different at our current size, right? But I think
you're much bigger.
Yeah, when we were 50 people or 100 people, you sort of had to pick and choose and say, hey, do I care about mom and pop SMB?
Where to start first?
Yeah, and so I think for us, we ultimately, the enterprise became our focus, right? So the kind of 2,000 biggest organizations, public sector, telco, media, that is really our big focus. I think now that we've gotten into more of a cloud offering, that's allowed us to go maybe down market to more of the SMB, smaller organizations. But predominantly, our main focus was kind of the biggest organizations.
Interesting. Well, that was kind of not prepared, but I kind of felt like this was important to share, because not every day do you see someone literally creating his first company, right? That was your first company, go from, a couple of peoples to 2000 and IPO later. Do you see, I guess, do you still have the you creating so many new products and so many new cool things? You're not bored. You always get to come up with new things. So I guess you're not going anywhere.
Yeah, no, bored is not a problem I have. Lack of time maybe is a problem I have, but bored is not.
Yeah, I guess it's always interesting, right? Because when I spend too much time on products, I get tired of it, and then I create a new company. That's why I founded 12, but I never grew them to IPOs, right? I made money, but I didn't, grow them to become as big as this. Although we had offices in 12 countries, so it's a nightmare already. Dealing with Dubai all the way to Latin America and 7 countries in Europe and Canada and the US. So it was a lot of learning. I'm sure you're dealing with the same issues, right? Having people, since you're very much distributed, you're having people all over the world, and you see the difference in culture and even for sales, right? Not just for employees, but also for the way you do deals. I remember signing $1 million deals on napkins in Dubai in a restaurant. That was always interesting. You wouldn't do that here.
I mean, it's a totally different sales culture as you travel around the world, and it's funny because you get kind of used to the American style of doing business, and then when you're in other parts of the world, you're like, oh wow, it's like culturally it's like a shock, right? When you're in these different places, like the Dutch are so much more direct, but the British are so much more indirect. So it's just like you kind of learn these different styles.
Yeah, no doubt. When you think of the market, we don't often have people here that are dealing with the pressure, I guess, of a publicly traded company, at least not at that level. When you think of the market, do you pay attention to the stock? Like, do you make decisions, short-term decisions, or you just don't care, ignore the noise, and you're just focusing on the big picture?
No, and people find this actually hard to believe, but like on a week-to-week basis, maybe I check our stock once in a week.
Yeah.
Because I think in some sense, it's like what you end up realizing is there's one day that you control the stock precisely. And even then, it's only for about the first 5 seconds when you IPO.
Right.
You control the stock price for exactly those 5 seconds. Beyond that, it's completely out of your control. So I think
it's pointless.
You're just sort of like, why should I stress myself out? I can't control that. I think the phrase our CEO always sort of uses is like, build a company worth investing in, right? And I think that's how we think about it, is it's like, okay, if you focus on the company and the execution and the things we control, you're going to build a company that's worth investing in. And that's what the markets will ultimately recognize. Versus if you do it in the other way around, I think you end up thinking short term, and you end up not optimizing for the ultimate long-term outcome.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, let's go back to our normal discussion, but that was fun. So obviously one of the first few products, right? I mean, you created a massive amount of products along the way, but the very first was always kind of focused around automation, right? I mean, all of the products pretty much care about automating things. So why do you think automation matter, and why did you start with creating Terraform?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think in some sense, to me, this goes to the very essence of like what makes cloud unique. And I think the big departure for cloud was that all of a sudden, instead of filing a ticket and a VMware admin, points and clicks and an interface, what Amazon gave us was an API, right? You could hit the create instance API, and an EC2 instance would show up. And so I think at the heart of that is, if you say, hey, if there's this shift from I file a ticket and someone points and clicks to there's an API, then there's a question of like, okay, but how do I consume those APIs, right? Like, either what I could do is log into the Amazon interface and use their web page, right? And that's basically a client of the backend API. But then I didn't really benefit much, right? Like, it's effectively turned into the same thing I was doing with VMware on premise. Or you start to say, actually, I have a different way of thinking about it. which is I can declare what I want my whole infrastructure to look like. And then I can leverage the fact that I have these APIs to automate the creation, updating, and destruction of my infrastructure end to end, right? And I think this is a subtle shift, but it's empowered by the fact that the cloud is actually API first, right? The UI and everything else comes later. The API was there originally. And so when we thought about Terraform, it was really around how do I orchestrate every aspect of my cloud infrastructure? And that's not just my cloud, right? It might be I'm on Amazon or Azure or Google, but I have the other pieces. I have Datadog, I have PagerDuty, I have Cloudflare, I have Fastly, et cetera. So how do I orchestrate all of those, which are all API driven, in a consistent way? And so I think what we realized was two things. One is if you use the low-level SDKs, it's too much work, it's too much programming, like you get bogged down in the details. So we need to abstract it to a higher level and really just say, hey, here's what my infrastructure should look like. The tool should go figure out what to do. And so that's, I think, the real magic of Terraform, is that as a user, I just tell Terraform, here's what I want. I want 10 VMs, a load balancer, a database, so on and so forth. And then Terraform will figure out what it needs to do and talk to all the different providers. And for us, we realized that that's how you're going to unlock the magic of cloud, right? Because then you're actually doing things in an API-driven way. You can dynamically scale up and down as you need to. You can spin up a development environment and then tear it down at the end of the day because you've automated all of it. And if you don't do that, if it's filing a ticket or I'm pointing and clicking in a UI, then I didn't really benefit from a cloud, right? It's just an even more expensive data center, right? Like effectively speaking. So that sort of led us down that path. And I think, from there, there's a whole host of other problems. So that's why we didn't stop with Terraform. But I think that's why we started there.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And of course, with the hybrid cloud aspect and the ability to deploy anywhere, and the more you think of the aspect of moving target defense and not being stuck in time and having the ability to tear down your entire stack and bring it back up, right? I mean, I guess I don't know how much you thought of that at the beginning of all this, but now it's becoming an additional. I mean, it started with automation and like saving time and money and being more efficient, right? And now it's also turning into, hey, this is now a foundation of cyber, right?
Right. Oh, it's huge. Yeah, I mean, I think just the example, like that's so concrete to me, is I think about the way we thought about patching forever and ever, right? The way you do, Microsoft Patch Tuesday comes around, and then you have to go interact with 1,000 machines or 10,000 machines to go patch them. But you think about that, and you're like, in a cloud world, you're like, isn't this kind of insane? You're like, why don't we just we'll make a new version of the machine image, which has all the patches applied, just boot 1,000 new VMs and just shoot your other 1,000 VMs in the head, right?
Yeah.
And like, don't bother with patching. Like, patching goes away in the cloud if you do it right, because you just move to an immutable style. But I think if you don't have automation tools like Terraform, that's crazy. If you tell someone, hey, just go spin up 10,000 machines and shoot your other 10,000 machines, they'd look at you like, that'll take me months.
Yeah. How much, when you've created this, how much did you think about the benefit of on the cyber side versus just like pure automation, convenience, easy access to automation? And how much did you actually see already at, what was it, 12 years, whatever ago, right? The benefit on the cyber cattle versus pet side?
It was probably like an 80-20 or 70-30.
Yeah. So you still had the insight of the cyber stuff. You could see that even
because
back
we
then.
felt the pain of it. And I think that's the important thing. Is me and Mitchell were operators before. And so it'd be like, oh, there's a vulnerability in the Linux kernel, or there's an OpenSSL bug. Let's go patch our entire fleet. And you're like, oh, this sucks. Like, now we're going to lose a whole week doing this. And so when you felt that pain, you're like, there's got to be a better way of doing this.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, this is it, right? This is it. I mean, the bunch of cloud provider then came up with their secret sauce nonsense, right? After you, right? And they all recognized the pain, but they felt that understanding the full problem, or at least, they let their greed of making money, right, get in the way of like common sense of making the product agnostic to the cloud provider. Do you feel like the reason why, Terraform got so big and so adopted was also because of that aspect of hybrid, avoiding vendor lock-in kind of aspect?
I think it was multiple different things. I think that's definitely a big part of it. Is I think people were like, the real world is multi-vendor, right? Like, nobody's 100% one vendor. It's like, you're like, okay, yeah, I have Amazon for this use case, I have Azure for that. Maybe I'm doing, VMware on premise. I have, different DNS providers and stuff. So you're like, I need a solution that's going to work across all of this. Otherwise, I end up with 20 different automation platforms, right? Like, and that's just a pain. So I think people really saw and realized, like, okay, I'm going to need one thing that works across all of this. I think the other aspect of it, and this is an even more basic one, is a user experience thing. I actually was at Amazon when they introduced CloudFormation, and I remember watching the initial demo, and I was like, "You expect users to use this? Like, this is such a painful experience."
It
I'm like,
was painful. I mean, it still is, I would argue, but they
"Yeah, I mean,
improved
it
it.
hasn't changed a lot." And I'm like, "Man, this is kind of rough."
User experience was always important to you, right?
And so, yeah, and so exactly. So to us, it was like, not only does it need to be agnostic and multi-cloud, but like the user experience has to be good fundamentally, right? Like
Yeah.
if someone's going to use this every day, we don't want them to be like, oh God, I have to use Terraform again.
Yeah, no doubt. So I mean that's also, my main aspect of pushing Terraform in the government was to make sure when we didn't get locked in, to cloud providers. That was really the main aspect. Of course, the convenience and ease of use was added benefits. But when you think on the government scale and the kind of money we're spending, it was so important for me at least to make sure we're not getting locked into to one CSP. So that
Exactly.
that's why we really I think we're probably one of the largest consumer of Terraform, looking at the size of the department. Not everybody's paying. I'm sorry, but there's a lot of that's what you get when you have an open source capability, right? So,
Totally.
but at least it's big. You're probably defending the entire nation all the way from satellite to nuclear weapons to jets and bombers. Not everybody can say that, right? So that's pretty cool.
It is. Yeah, I think we crossed a fun milestone last week, which I think the Terraform Amazon provider did its billionth download.
Wow.
So it gives you a
Wow.
sense of just like the scale of the usage,
Yeah.
right? Like it's everywhere.
Well, once you make it in space and nukes, I gotta say, the volume doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
It's just like another level of achievements. It's just like past the just numbers. But anyway, so people, when you started, of course, you wanted to build this cloud automation company, right? But you always felt like, and we talk about the 80-20 already, but you always felt like cyber was so important. Why was it such a pillar, right, of your entire decision-making process?
But, and I think it's multiple things. One is I think, yes, is the provisioning style different between private data center and cloud? Because now we think about APIs and automation, yes, but it's not this like radical shift. There's a lot of organizations that automated their private data center and still applied those techniques there. But I think when we think about security in the cloud, it actually is fundamentally different. Like it's radically different than what we did in private data center. And so that's why to us it was always so important. It was like you're actually not going to succeed in cloud and see all of its benefits unless you rethink your entire approach to security. And what I mean by that is historically it was very much like protect the perimeter, put some firewalls in place. You think about IP as the right level of control, but your infrastructure was relatively static. It was VM based and you had a well-defined sort of four walls of the data center. As you think about cloud, all of that goes away. Right? Your infrastructure is much more dynamic. It's coming and going all the time, right? It gets even worse if you get to containers. It gets even worse if you get to Lambda functions. They're coming and going, right? You don't have a strong sense of IP anymore because everything is dynamic. So IPs are coming and going, right? And you don't even have a sense of clear perimeter anymore because you're like, I have a virtual network. I don't have like the four walls. So all of a sudden, you actually have to think about security in a totally different way where you're like, I need to push it up to the application level. I need to think about mutual TLS. I need to think about application layer security in addition to sort of perimeter-based security. And so all of that stuff for us was like then deeply interconnected to the automation. Like if I'm automating, but I bring up an insecure infrastructure, like that's a problem. So as part of my automation, I need to bring up an infrastructure where the security is fundamentally baked into it. And that requires a different way of thinking about security automation, identity-based approaches, zero trust. So that's why to us, it was like, these are all deeply related. Like if you're going to do one thing right with the automation, you have to get the security right. Otherwise, you're going to bring up some insecure thing and get hacked 10 seconds later, right? And that's not very useful.
That was pretty bad. Yeah, you're accelerating the pace of getting hacked.
Exactly.
That'll be pretty bad. Yeah. So the first security product you built was Vault. Why did you start there?
I think it goes back to actually the Terraform problem, which is like,
Right.
to make it
Right.
really, really concrete, let's say I'm going to provision a set of web servers dynamically with Terraform. The first thing those web servers need is their credential to log into the database.
All right.
How do they get
Tough. Yeah.
that? Literally
Yeah.
the very first thing they need. And so you run right into a brick wall where you say, okay, now I
Yeah.
have two choices. Either I hard code the database username and password. You can see what's
That
going to
would
be
be
wrong,
awesome. Yeah.
right? You're like, that's clearly bad. Or I need to
Yep.
have some manual process where I'm logging in and copy pasting a credential, and I'm going to break the automation of the cloud. And so right
Yeah.
away, you see both of those are bad answers. I shouldn't do either of them. So
Yeah.
you're like, what I really should do is dynamically, those web servers need to come up. Somehow they need to authenticate against a service. That service then needs to say, you're a valid web server. Here's your database credential. And I need the ability to automate the rotation of those credentials on an ongoing
Right.
basis.
Because they have to be short-lived.
Exactly. So you bring all those problems together, and all of a sudden you say, well, what's the solution? There was nothing in existed in the
So
market.
you had to bring it. Yeah.
We had to go and
But
build something.
did you realize already back then the importance of the short-lived aspect of this, or that came later?
What made it really, really clear for us was in the early days, where maybe 15 people, our head of operations and SRE left the company. And all of a sudden we're like, didn't he have a root Amazon credentials? And all of
But
a sudden,
it kind of makes sense for people, though, right? But I think, I mean, at least from what I remember, most people did not think of it for NPEs, right? They were, I mean, I think it was pretty obvious for people. People understood, like, okay, someone is going to leave the organization. You're going to want to change the credentials and stuff. Okay, people get that. But the NPE side, I feel like, given nowadays, honestly, but, people still don't think of the necessity, right, to rotate.
right. And I think in some sense, this goes back to the very beginning and some of these academic origins, which is when we started to build Vault, the original inspiration, you might laugh at this, was Kerberos. So if you go
Yeah,
all
of
the way
course.
back to like the 80s with Kerberos, if you really
Yeah,
look at its design, all of Kerberos is based on short-lived
yeah,
credentials.
that's
Because
true. They
even
were
back
pretty small.
even
Yeah,
back then,
right.
MIT they figured out, they're like, if you have long-lived credentials, that becomes a point of compromise.
Yeah, it's kind of common sense, but
It's common sense. And so I think what we looked at and said, it's really no different for an application. If it has a long-lived credential, eventually it's going to leak it. Eventually someone's going to, put it somewhere they shouldn't, or log it somewhere they
right.
shouldn't. And so the only way around that is you have to make it short-lived.
Rotate. But then you have the chicken and the egg problem, right? Because if you want to rotate the stuff, you still have to authenticate to Vault, right? How do you know the services would they claim to be for you to assign these credentials? So how did you figure that one out? Because that one would have, my brain would have imploded and I would be dead.
Honestly, again, we went back to Kerberos and we said, well, how did
Right.
Kerberos solve this problem? Which was they basically had this two-layer system. You have a client to Kerberos first layer authentication. And so the way Vault solves that is we integrate with like Amazon, for example, or Azure or Google deeply. So we say, okay, the machine is trying to connect to Vault. Talk back to Amazon and validate the identity of, is the credential valid? Is the certificate signed? Has it expired, etc. So we formed this three-leg relationship between Vault, the platform, and the client. And then once that is valid, then we say, okay, based on that, you're allowed to go get a dynamic credential, which is short-lived, right? But we have this sort of two-level relationship where both of them are dynamic. You have to keep logging in over and over to make sure that the client's still valid. And at the same time, the underlying credential is being rotated over and over again. So it's sort of this two-level dynamic relationship that makes it work.
Yeah, that's so cool. It's always interesting to me how all these problems get solved. But I guess you had a little bit of a leg up advantage when it came to Kerberos, so that's good.
I think Kerberos' problem is that the user experience once again sucked, right? Like user experience, like nobody who has ever tried implementing Kerberos has ever had a good time.
But that's also, I think they did not have the other pillar you got. You had cyber, but you also had automation, and then you had user experience. I would say both the automation and the user experience were just not really central to their model. So I think that's also what you got, for them to bring a better product. But
exactly.
All right, so let's look at your approach when it came to zero trust. Well, you talked about the perimeter moving away. I started pushing zero trust very early, first at DHS 6 years ago. Of course, people looked at me, thought I was crazy, and then they ended up leaving the government and go sell consulting to help people do zero trust, because that's what people do, and they blocked it when they were in the government, but now they sell the consulting, because it's obvious and they have to do it. And so, it's been always interesting, right, for me to see how bloated kind of zero trust became. So tell us a little bit about your own approach.
Totally. And I think to your point, I think it's been an evolution, right? Like, I think even if we talked about zero trust 6 years ago, people would look at us like we're crazy. So I think me and you have been in the same boat, with a lot of people giving us that look like, what are you talking about? But, I think for us, it goes back to this acknowledgement of first principles, what's changing in cloud, right? And I think if you sort of start by saying, okay, your scale is 10x or 100x what it was on-prem. Your rate of change is 10x or 100x what it was on-prem. And the distribution of your clients is 10 or 100x what you had before, because now you have people working from home, multiple clouds, hybrid, etc. So every sort of thing that made the problem hard, you've multiplied by 10 or 100x. So your normal approach to things just won't work. And so we said, okay, how do you start to solve the fact that these things are all 10 or 100x more? You have to shift the approach, meaning instead of managing a set of IPs that are dynamic and coming and going, what's something that's more static? Right, that doesn't change. And I think for us, it's really stepping back and acknowledging that it's the identity that doesn't change. If I have the identity that this is web application A or web application B, I don't care if I have 1, 10, or 1,000 copies of that application or which cloud they're running on. What I care about is the identity of that app and what systems it has permission to access. So for us, it was about reorienting everything around identity as the core concept. And so whether that's user identity or machine and application identity, that's the core primitive. And then from there, you say, well, what are the core networking flows, right? First, you have to establish human identity. That might be single sign-on with whatever your identity provider is. Then you have to establish your application identity. That's where Vault started and really brought that Kerberos model. And then you have the network flows, which is I have a machine-to-machine access pattern, right? Okay, if my web server is going to my database, normally I put a firewall in the middle. But how do I do it if I'm not using a firewall, if I'm not using an IP address? You got to rethink that. And then same with a human to machine. If I have a human database admin getting to my database, before I might have had them go over VPN, but the VPN gave them raw network access, right? So now I need to rethink that and say, I don't want to give you network access, and I want my controls to be tied to the app or user identity. So I say developers have access to the database, or web server A has access to the database.
It's more granular.
What?
It's more granular, yeah. It's more granular, effective.
It's both granular, but I think it also shields you from the dynamic nature. Because if I say, hey, web service A can talk to the database, do I care what the IP of the web server is? No. Do I care if you have 1, 10, or 1,000,000 copies? No. The rule is the same. So
as long as you can identify it, right? That's the key. It's back to the identity stuff, right?
Bingo. And this is why it's like all roads bring you back to identity. So for us, that's the core of the approach, is solve that machine identity with Vault, integrate with the human identity, and then use tools like Consul and Boundary to solve the machine to machine or the human to machine problem. But it's all tied back to your point to identity.
Yeah, no doubt. And so most identity management companies, right, really focused on the person entity side, right, and kind of pushed away the NPE side as if it was not really important, and so they're paying the price now. But do you feel like having a holistic management of identity, both on the P and NP side, to create policy as code and kind of the same enforcement across both is essential nowadays, or what's your take on that?
Yeah, exactly. I think people used to break it down into almost, I'll call it these, like, they treat them like these independent network paths, right? We would talk about, you had a north-south network path and an east-west network path and a privileged access network path. And you'd sort of manage all of these in like a different way. But I think what people are realizing is, like, in the cloud world, like, what's the difference between them? They all start to blend together because it's, those lines are blurry now. So our view is, like, you can't treat them as these totally distinct things. It's now the network is a mess, right?
It's too messy.
South now looks like east-west. It's all kind of looks the same. So you need a unified approach across all of it.
Yeah, plus if you're on multiple clusters, multiple clouds, multiple locations, I mean, you're going to end up having a very blurry north-south, east-west, set of views, and it's going to be very difficult to manage that scale, right?
Exactly. I view that everything ties back to identity in a consistent way.
So, someone was asking on Twitter, I'm going to ask here because I can't show it on the screen, but when you look at your portfolio, right, of products, you look at first your revenue and then more about downloads, right, for the open source stuff. Which product effectively has the most success nowadays?
Yeah, I think what we shared publicly is that Terraform and Vault, collectively are 80% plus of the revenue. So those two are the key products. But it's kind of not surprising for us because those were the earliest products we built, and they're the ones that we focused on to commercialize early. I think for us, as we think about sort of deeper in the pipeline, we're super excited about the traction Consul's building because I think people are realizing you need a modern kind of service mesh, zero trust approach to your networking. And so that product's been kind of gaining quite a bit of adoption and traction. In fact, it's our most downloaded product right behind Terraform. And then I think beyond that, we have a pipeline of newer products, right? Waypoint and Boundary are much, much newer for us. We only released them, less than 2 years ago. So those are much newer. So it makes sense that they don't have the adoption of, a Terraform or Vault that have been around a lot longer.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. All right. So we talked about kind of your approach of zero trust, but you talked about Consul, right? So for people that don't know, of course, Consul is a service mesh, kind of, I guess, competing against Istio. We could say that. So when you compare, right, the two landscape, and you see kind of the pros and cons of both, right? Envoy, obviously, the proxy on Istio, massive footprint even outside of Istio, right? A lot of people using it, even if they don't use the control plane of Istio. What's your take on Consul and the benefits there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think Consul actually is an interesting one because actually one of our oldest products in the portfolio. It actually predates even Vault and Terraform. So it goes all the way back to 2014. Yeah. And I think the reason for it is just like the example I gave of the web server talking to the database needs a password. When the web server talks to the database, how does it know the IP address of the database?
Right.
Because in a dynamic world, you don't want to hard code an IP address.
Right.
So the first problem you actually have is like, how do all these services discover?
Discovery. Yeah.
So that's where Consul started around. If I'm automating, I need an automated way to do discovery. So we started with that problem. And I think the key insight there was you have this problem across multiple platforms, across multiple operating systems, and across multiple clouds. Because I might have a Windows app in Azure that needs to discover a Linux app running in AWS. So Consul's fundamentally designed to be multi-cloud, multi-platform, multi-OS, right, from the very beginning, right? And so that was a key part of its design. Flash forward to the last 2-3 years where Consul's evolved into a full-blown service mesh. Now we think about it as multiple layers, which is solving a discovery problem at the core, but then layering on a mesh strategy, which for folks that are maybe less familiar, it's really about, I think, pushing, I'll call it the network trust problem, out of the network into the application layer. So I want to use an app identity to say service A can talk to service B, and I'm going to enforce all of that through mutual TLS and PKI, et cetera, right? So that's kind of at the heart of what we've always thought about is that sort of core multi-problem, multi-everything. And so when I kind of distinguish it with Istio very much grew out of the same sort of problem space, but focused within the Kubernetes environment, because that's where it was born. That's where sort of Google created it out of their Kubernetes problem. And so I think it very much, that's what it focuses on, is that Linux, Kubernetes sort of modern greenfield environment. And they use Envoy as well as Consul. So Consul, we also use Envoy as our underlying data proxy. But for us, we look at a much broader set of usage. Yes, you can use Consul just within Kubernetes, but a lot of our customers actually use it to span these different environments. So they might have a Windows IaaS app. Actually, we have a very large public sector customer that their use case is they have a set of Windows applications that are interfacing with their modern containerized stuff, and they use Consul as the service mesh between those things. Because if we look at a lot of large industry, large public sector use cases, you have a lot of Windows, you have a lot of non-container workload. And so how do you modernize those to sort of a zero trust approach with service mesh without rewriting everything, right? And I think that's where Consul's kind of multi-cloud, multi-platform, multi-OS becomes a really important differentiator. It's like, yeah, you can use it on Windows with your non-container workload. That's fine.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you're giving your open source projects are not part of CNCF, right?
No, HashiCorp is a member of the CNCF, but our projects
you're a
are
member
under
of it,
CNCF governance.
What was a driver? Is it just control? I guess controlling the pod. I mean, I assume that's what it is, but
Yeah, I mean, if I'm entirely blunt, my view is, good software is not built by committee.
yeah, no. I mean, it's a nightmare. I've been fighting Google to put Istio in CNCF for years, so I finally managed to convince them to some degree. But it's been a nightmare. Yeah, no doubt.
So I think for us, that was always the view, was like, if we have sort of total control of it, obviously we're open to our community, and I think most people see us as good stewards of the projects.
Sure.
But we don't have to battle with Huawei on what Huawei thinks we should do. You know what I mean? It's like, guess what?
Huawei is a pretty good example where we don't want Huawei anywhere close to our stuff here. So,
but they're a very large CNCF member. So it's like,
I know, and you look at I'm actually pretty worried also about the number of Chinese companies in CNCF is getting between the distributions and even like the contributors. I mean, for us, in DoD and stuff, I mean, we have to be worried about that stuff. So
exactly,
just,
and I think for us,
massive volume.
We know that like 100% of the upstream is controlled by HashiCorp, and we don't have to worry about anybody else. So I think for us, that's an important aspect of it.
Yeah, it is important. And when you look at your company footprint, where is mostly your team located now of the 2000? Where are you based off mostly?
Predominantly North America. I'd probably say 70% North America, and then Europe is probably the next 20%, and then and then beyond that, it's sort of teams all around the world. Pockets everywhere from Australia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Latin America, India. You name it.
Yeah, and these are mostly like sales or developers too.
It's a whole mix of things. It's sales, support, some engineering offices, customer success. So kind of ranges the whole gamut.
Yeah,
a lot of finance and sort of back office, HR.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, Consul does not use Envoy, right? Is that correct?
It does use Envoy.
Oh, it does. It does use Envoy. Okay. Yeah. So you have effectively you have a different control plane for people that don't know, right? So you have compared to Istio, right? You have your own control plane, but you do use the same proxy.
Exactly. And our view is
also on the boundary product.
Sorry, repeat that.
On the new boundary product that you launched, is that also using Envoy or not?
No, that doesn't use Envoy. That's its own kind of proxy.
Okay. So you ended up. Did you see like a future where you end up moving Consul to that new proxy you guys, I guess, had to create for this boundary product?
The two serve a pretty different need. I think boundary is much closer to, because it's more human to machine. I think it needs a little bit more. It's more focused on things like session recording and session management and stuff that doesn't make sense in Envoy, because you're not going to manage individual session with Envoy. Like, it's much more machine to machine and automated, where like you might say, hey, Armon is SSH to this database and I want to terminate that one session, which is much more of a people oriented problem. So I think the two just end up being pretty distinct because the problem domains they don't overlap.
In fact, maybe we should give a little bit of for the team that don't know what boundary is. Give us a rundown of what it is, because it's pretty new. So
yeah, so boundary, maybe about 2 years ago, we launched it. Really, a modern take on kind of a privilege access management tool, right? So I think what we saw was a lot of people use, I'll call it legacy solutions, kind of like CyberArk or Thycotic, CAPAM, where it's like you VPN into your network, then you have to like log into a PAM solution to kind of copy paste a credential to then go log into the target machine. And I think we felt like there's a few problems, which is one, it's kind of a kludgy user interface. But two, you're kind of violating a whole lot of the zero trust principles, right? Like you have access to the private network, you have access to secrets you probably shouldn't have. Things are static and long-lived credentials. So there's a bunch of these kind of problems, and we said, okay, what's a modern approach to this? Where we said, instead, use your single sign-on identity. I saw some mentions in the comments about things like Azure AD. Great example. As I'm Armon, the developer, I'm going to log in with my Azure identity, right, through my single sign-on. I don't need a VPN credential. I don't need a certificate. Once I single sign-on, I'll see a list of what are the services I'm allowed to connect to, driven by a consistent policy based on my identity. And it might say, okay, Armon can connect to the database. When I double-click on that, boundary will then connect me directly to the database. It won't give me network access. It won't let me connect to whatever I want on the network. I only get access to that particular database. And to the extent boundary supports it, right? It supports a ton of different protocols. We'll do a dynamic credential unique to that session. So the moment I disconnect, the credential is revoked. And then we'll also inject the credential so the user never even sees it. So it's really a modern approach to privileged access management, saying it should be based on identity. It should be dynamic, short-lived credentials. It should be revoked the moment you disconnect. So really bringing in a lot of those same zero trust concepts and applying it to privileged access management.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. All right, so we talk about Consul. Now, obviously we're all embracing this kind of GitOps mindset, right? And so how do we deal with the policy and compliance piece? Someone asked a question also that goes pretty well with that. He was asking, how do we get assessment and compliance on board in this new dynamic environment, right? I guess making them shift left and be part of the team is probably the piece of the answer, right?
Totally. Well, it reminds me of, if you never follow this account, it's hilarious. It's DevOps Borat on Twitter. Yeah. This hilarious tweet that was basically like, ops is make a mistake, break one machine. DevOps is make a mistake, break 1,000 machines.
Right, pretty much.
And so, and I think there's a truth to that, right? Because once you have that power of that automation, if I make a security mistake, I can roll that out to my entire fleet instantly, basically, right? Where if I'm doing a manual ops, I'm going to break one machine or one firewall, right? And so I think in the same way we automated the infrastructure, you have to automate the security and policy and governance as well, because otherwise you're never going to keep pace with it, right? The developer is just going to break 1,000 machines and you're not going to notice in time.
Right.
So it goes back to that shift left that you mentioned. And so our view is, how do I move from a world where I interface with a security or compliance team and they're manually going through a ticketing or a manual review process, to giving them the right tooling to say, I'm going to write policy as code, right? And that's really our view of where this goes, is I write the security policy or the compliance policy as code. And that's getting checked and enforced in an automated way now. So when the developer tries to push the change that would break 1,000 machines and open my firewall, there's a policy guardrail that says, no, you're not allowed to make that change, and it prevents it, right? And that's, I think, the only way security and compliance is going to keep pace with this, right? And so one of actually my favorite customers is FIS Global. So for folks that aren't familiar, they're basically the back office for thousands of banks, right? So they do a bunch of the back office work of really administering a bank. And so they're a very large scale customer of Terraform and Sentinel and Policy as Code. They've talked publicly at our conferences about how they do this. You can imagine their environment. They have to deal with every banking regulator. And their only way they can keep pace as they move to cloud is they're moving all of these checks to being policies that are automated, right? And that's how you're going to do this at scale. And so I think for them, it went from the security team was almost, I'll call it the enemy of cloud, to they were the number one supporter, because they started to see like, oh, if we automate these guardrails, we actually have more reach, more visibility, and more control than we ever did in a traditional environment.
Yeah, that's how you get the buy-in. And so I believe you always said these kind of three pillars, right? For the policy as code universe, there's the security operations, and I forgot the third one. What is it again?
Yeah, I think it's security, compliance, and operational best practice, as those are the pillars we think about of like, because I think people often think about just security and compliance, but I actually think operational best practice is a really important one, which is, if you have a developer who's going to deploy the weekend with only one VM, let's say, or they're deploying a database with backup turned on, that's an operational risk. But if I have a policy that says the moment you create a database, it has to have backups enabled, or if you deploy a VM behind a load balancer, you have to have at least two of them. So if one fails, there's another one.
Right.
Those are really important operational things that improve your hygiene.
So when you had to build Sentinel, right, which is your product that does kind of this policy as code enforcement stuff, that must have been a nightmare to have to deal with all these different scenarios, because it seems you're not just using basic example of like, oh, I'm not going to deploy the weekend, on Friday night, 8 p.m. That's a pretty easy time of day criteria. But the stuff you just use is like, oh, you need to know if there's redundancy or backup enable things. That must be a pretty complex thing to deal with.
Yes, yeah, it is. And I think it goes back to us, there was a few things that were important, which is like, one was the usability of this stuff, which is like, do you make it easy to write rules and easy to kind of author without being an expert? So we spent a lot of time on like the policy language. So if you look at it, it kind of looks and feels like Python, but it's really optimized for writing policy. Like there's a first-class concept of a rule. There's first-class concepts of composition of multiple rules and how they interact with each other, right? And so we sort of came at it from the position of, let's say you're writing a security policy, how do we make it easy to author this thing? So the policy language is designed to make it easier, but two, it needed to be open-ended. So we've really thought about making it flexible and extensible. So you can bring in your own plugins and integrations with it and say, oh, I actually need to make an API call to my custom system, or I need to call out to ServiceNow to look for a change management ticket. So it's not designed just to be a walled garden. We have open APIs and extensibility so that you can call out to all these other systems and make a complete policy decision. Because you might say database backup should be enabled for production, but for a development environment, I don't care. Like, why should I pay to back up a development environment? I don't care, right? And so those kind of rich policy decisions, you need to be able to model all of that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I'm a big fan of OPA, but I got to say Rego is a disaster.
It is a disaster. I mean, the language is based on, and you'll see this later on from us this year. We'll add more OPA support, but the language is based on Prolog, and like, how many developers do you know that like Prolog?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the whole thing is it's a user experience nightmare. I guess that's why the company is focused on making a UI so you don't have to write it, because it's it's so painful.
Yeah, and I think our view at the end of the day is we care about the workflow, right? So we care about the policy as code workflow. In the end, if someone has a strong preference for Sentinel versus Rego versus Python, like, it doesn't matter to us. It's about how do we enable that workflow to be policy as code.
So are you saying, is Sentinel just the policy as code language, or what's the enforcement piece? I guess, how do you decouple the two? I guess.
This is where it gets a little bit blurry, because you can think about Sentinel as both a policy engine but also its own specific language. And so we're in the process of untangling some of that to say, you know what, maybe you don't want the Sentinel language, you want to use Rego, Python, or whatever. Yeah. But the engine is consistent.
The engine is still, so it's still called Sentinel for the enforcement point.
Right. Kind of like Terraform, right? Like Terraform, you can write our HCL, but you can also write Python or Java or TypeScript or whatever you want. But it's all Terraform at the end of the day.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so that's policy as code, compliance as code, right? And of course, you have the operation stuff where you have so many use cases there. And like you said, you could have custom tickets things, using APIs and other things to talk to different things, whether it's custom or like ServiceNow or whatever Jira thing. So I guess we did talk about Sentinel a little bit, but what we didn't really explain is why really policy as code really matters.
Right. I think, and we've seen this so many times that it's almost an internal, it's almost, we've called it Cloud 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 is almost what inevitably happens is we see organizations go on a Cloud 1.0 journey where they run out, they start doing their infrastructure automation, they let their application teams kind of build things in cloud, but they don't modernize their approach to security or compliance. And so very quickly, 12 months in, 9 months in, they run into a brick wall where their security team says, stop deploying. Because now they've basically had too many security issues. People are going out and doing whatever things. It's inconsistent. They don't have controls in place. And so then the security team says, whoa, until we can put our hands around this stuff, stop. And now it's blocked the organization's cloud adoption. And so then what we end up seeing is almost what we call Cloud 2.0, where people realize, actually, I need to have a more centralized approach to cloud, where I create a consistent pipeline of how am I deploying, what are the policy guardrails around that, how am I make sure I'm doing this in a secure way, in a compliant way, and it's not just Wild West chaos, basically. And in that transition to sort of a Cloud 2.0, that's where we often see like a platform team or an SRE team that's really building a consistent pipeline and enabling the security teams to come in and do that policy as code. So that, great, when I'm enabling app team 50 and 51 and 100, that it's not just chaos, right? Because otherwise, there's no way. The security teams can't scale to having 100 app teams doing whatever hell they want.
Where do you see on the shift left universe, where do you see a policy as code team sit? Is it part of the SRE side of the house? Is it developers? Well, how do you see those guys, I guess?
Honestly, it varies quite a bit by organization and just their skill set. I think with some orgs, if you have a very, what I'll call it, operational security team, the security team will take ownership of it because they're used to writing code, they're used to automating, and they want to own and author the policy. I think you see other organizations where security is less operational. They're more of a policy organization. And so there, the security team might write the policy in a Word doc or whatever. And then it's the responsibility generally of the operations or the platform team to sort of translate that into, great, I'm going to write the policy as code that automates that. But they're more responsible for running it. So it varies a little bit organization by organization, just based on where the operational skill set sits. But it's either the security teams or sort of the cloud platform DevOpsy type groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we're talking about policy as code, but I was a big proponent of software-defined perimeter, SDP, not SDN, but really the SDP side of the house. And how do you see SDP fit, with zero trust, and what's different about it?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. So I think if we go back to, I think, what was the predecessor to SDP?
Yeah.
It was really that you had, your four-wall data center. Maybe there was the front door where, firewall load balancer where internet-facing traffic came in. And then you had your side door where your users came in through the VPN, for example. And I think the problem with that approach was the user came in through the VPN, you dumped them on the network, and then you had this giant, wide open, flat network that the user could move laterally across and do whatever.
It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and if maybe the user was, good and they didn't do anything bad, but maybe the user was malicious and they moved
just compromised device,
compromised device, or you had a SolarWinds type of attack or whatever.
Yeah,
I think that type of lateral movement was really the problem in these networks.
Right.
I think with SDP, we sort of reframed that and said, you know what, maybe you shouldn't just have a VPN where it's kind of binary, where it's like all or nothing access.
All or nothing.
Right? And it said, okay, it actually should be a granular thing that says, okay, you're Armon, you're a developer, you have access to this set. Oh, you're Bob, you're a business analyst. Okay, you only have access to this. You're Alice and you're a C-suite executive. Okay, you only have even more limited access, right? And so it's really about having a fine-grained segmentation of like your users coming to the network. Can I have a policy that guides them to only the resources they have access to? And so I think that's the core heart of it. And I think you can see why there's a high overlap to zero trust, because it's about identity-based access. It's about fine granularity. It's about avoiding that all or nothing network visibility and access. And so for us, that was where, looking at SDP and saying, how do you make that a good product experience? That's what led us to build Boundary. But it's all the same ideas of SDP, basically, right? And so there's high overlap between zero trust and SDP.
Yeah. For me, it's a big same shared set of concepts. And when I think of that segmentation, we mentioned also the importance of the device, being used by the user. My implementation of zero trust in DoD, which is the largest implementation I think in the world, but at the very least in the government. When you think of device enforcement, we added multiple layers to assess the device state, the patching state of the device, the device identity, right? The ability to look at the endpoint protection solution running, what's running there, right? How do you think about kind of the importance of not just looking at the user identity, but also looking at the device being used?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it as if you change one word and just say it's device identity, then I think you see why it's all consistent, right? It all comes back to that identity, right? Because I think the way we think about it is like, great, you need to have an association between the device and the user. It's like, hey, when I issue this laptop to Armon, I should have an asset management system that knows that belongs to me. It doesn't belong to Alice, right? And so then I should be able to correlate and say, okay, not only should I see Armon's login, I should only see one of the, it's either his laptop or his desktop, right? Those are the two assets, or his phone maybe that he's coming in. Yep. So I should be able to tie that back to the device's identity. And then to your point, I want to have an inventory that says, is it running the latest operating system? Is it patched? Do I have full disk encrypt on? Right, so on and so forth. But then the heart of how we're actually executing the policy is ultimately coming back to identity. Right? That's what the rules are going to be based around, right? And then,
but it could be device identity and user identity combined. So like my rules in DoD, we had like the compounded risk of the device identity and the user identity, and based on both, then you get granted access. So like if I use my personal device versus my government device, I'm still me, but I don't get access to classified stuff. You know what I
Correct.
mean?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. You might say I have a tier 1 set of applications. You need to be on a special device for that. Tier
Right.
2, maybe they're just checking their email, let's say. Okay, fine. You can
Right.
check your email on your personal device, but you can't go beyond that into any tier 1 system, right?
Right.
So I think you're right. You have this sort of access tiering. But again, it's device identity, human identity, and then having that consistent policy around it.
And what kind of partnership or engagements did you have to go through or do or think about or will do when it comes to the device understanding of the state of the device? Because I know you deal with the device identity, and you can look at the asset management stuff, but how do you pull that device state, right? Whether it's using the right settings or the right endpoint protection solution, Windows update up to date or whatever, right? Did you have to build your own stuff, or you're partnering with other companies, or what's the vision there?
Yeah, and I think this is where I think we try and cleanly delineate what we do versus where we partner. So it's like we're not trying to replace people's identity provider. So we actually work very closely with Okta, Ping, Centrify, Azure, right? So our view is you're going to have your human identity management system, right?
Right.
Maybe it's Azure, maybe it's Okta, whatever. And oftentimes the device, end user device, is closely tied into that. So even internally, we're big users of Okta. And so we tightly integrate with that. So it's like, okay, great, let's pull that information out of their single sign-on provider and then feed that into sort of the rules and decision-making that we're doing downstream. But our view is, hey, there's a great set of vendors out there that have been solving this problem for a while. Let's just go integrate with them.
So you gave me I guess a little door here to ask you a question about that kind of stuff, because I'm a big fan of SaaS, but I have an issue of multi-tenancy SaaS, right? For a few things, particularly identity management and policy enforcement points. I feel like it's a pretty big risk, and you've seen, of course, Okta getting breached, and I would argue the way they handled it, not disclosing it immediately, waiting 4 months, and I mean I know it's only 2.5% of the customer, but still, if you're part of the 2.5%, you're probably not happy. So does that make you rethink, or how do you think about, with you that's so security conscious, I guess, I'm a little surprised that you're like, okay, we're just going to use Okta and trust this SaaS multi-tenancy hosting that we have zero visibility on to effectively decide who gets access to our stuff.
No, yeah, it's a great point. And I think when we think about how we build and deliver software and then how we consume it even ourselves, I think we try and deliver in multiple flavors. So we have obviously the open source and then the commercial self-managed, and then there's a cloud offering. Even within our cloud offering, things like Vault, for example, are managed single tenant solutions. So you get a single
multi-tenant is tough, right?
Multi-tenant is tough, and you have different sort of bleed overs. So I think we think about it that way of like, okay, how do we satisfy that? Because we have some customers that are like, I don't even want cloud or managed. I want air gapped. I run it myself. Okay, great. Right. You can pick it and run it yourself. That's fine. To your point, some of the stuff is on a submarine. You're not going to run it in cloud.
You don't have a choice.
Right. So you're going to self-manage that. That's okay. So that's how we think part of it. And then when we think about like some of the stuff we consume, like Okta, what we actually do is we think about how do you air gap against a single failure. So you actually have multiple directory systems. So if you want to get to our production environment, you're not only single signing on through Okta, you have a second single sign on through an independent IDP. So it's like, even if you breach one of our IDPs, you got a second IDP that's completely separate, managed differently, different user group permissions, and you have to jump through both of those. So I think it's thinking through defense in depth, and you're like, okay, what if this system is compromised? What's your compensating control, basically?
But you wouldn't think, I guess, having at least your because for email, right? I doubt you do this for just email authentication. I don't. Maybe you do. Do you do it for basic thing or just for production?
No, it's only for like production system access.
Because with stuff like SolarWinds, right? They initially got into emails to gather information, intel. I mean, you can do a lot. People keep diminishing the power of email, but you can do a lot.
You can do a lot.
Just seeing people's email, but so. You wouldn't think so. Are you using Okta for is that your primary, I guess, for email and stuff? I guess
that's our primary. Yeah. But then a big thing for us is we actually have moved everyone. So actually, it was a big push by our security team to hardware security. So we have YubiKeys that we issue to everybody.
Right.
So in addition
they
to your
have to have the YubiKeys on top of Okta. Okay.
you have to have a hardware
So
security.
you're doing multiple factors.
Yeah. We have all of the MFAs.
Yeah, which the YubiKey is probably the best, right? Because it's something you have, and I don't know the version you use, but the one you're looking at in DoD is you have to actually push the button on it to
Exactly. Ours has
physically
like
prove you're there, right?
physical
So
contact tab. Exactly.
yeah, so you have to be there physically. You can just
It can't just be plugged in. Yeah.
right, because some people leave their stuff plugged in. We have smart cards, we put in our laptops in the government, and it's often just stayed in the laptop, so that doesn't really help, to know you're here, so
Exactly.
that makes sense. But most organizations will not have the knowledge to build what you just described, with 280p and this whole dual thing for production environments. Do you then think, okay, are you comfortable with people using multi-tenancy identity management stacks? Forget about Okta in general, but I'm just talking in general. Would you recommend customers, particularly for critical stuff like banking and government, like nuclear stuff? I'm sure it's air gap, but anything else? Do you feel like it's just safer to be on the single tenant? I mean, I'm not saying you can do a SaaS, right? But it, it's better if it's a single tenant kind of thing.
So I'd say it depends on the context. And what I mean by that is there's kind of two dimensions I think about it on, which is one is what's the skill and capability of the users operating it.
Right.
Which is there's a lot of organizations that they don't have the bench of security and operational expertise to keep this stuff patched, secure, monitoring, reaction, have a full SOC 24/7. So for a lot of those scenarios, you'd say, actually, you're better off if someone else who has those capabilities is running it for you than if you're doing it.
Unless they lie to you for 4 months.
What?
Unless if they lie to you for 4 months and don't tell you. That's kind of the issue, right? If you don't know. I mean, how many companies you've seen Uber and everybody's getting sued and like did not disclosing? And we definitely need a law. I think we all agree with this, where we need something that says, hey, you have to disclose stuff when stuff like that happens to your customer. It's kind of mind-boggling.
Interestingly, we actually are seeing a bunch of movement on that. We actually see a lot of it in some of our more regulated customers, where they're actually pushing down contractual terms that restrict basically your time bound of how long you have for notifications, things like that. So
are they asking you that kind of stuff to you, for example?
Exactly. So I think we're seeing that come down the pipe basically, as people are sort of seeing that.
You have to be big enough though, right, to get people to change the terms. Most people just click yes, right? So I don't know how much a small company can do that. Yeah.
I think the other dimension, but then I think about is like, who's the vendor? Like if I'm thinking about like Microsoft, like they probably have 1,000 people in their security org, right? Just thinking about Azure AD.
Right.
And so I think when I think about an organization like that, you're like, yeah, they're probably going to do a better job running managed Azure AD than someone who's running an unpatched version of Windows Server.
Right. They also have the largest number of CVEs, but it's interesting, right? Sometimes the largest company is not. I mean, look at you guys. You're pretty small compared to Microsoft, but you have a pretty good track record. You compare to an Atlassian, it was 1,400 CVEs. You're like, what's going on? So, I guess it's also like the kind of the own discipline you have. That's why I was interested when you said, hey, we're using Okta, but then I'm pretty happy to hear you say, well, yes, but we have this and this and this. If you did not have that, I would be a little bit more concerned. I gotta admit. So I feel a lot better, after you mentioned Okta, because I just there's a few things, and look, it's really for identity management and policy enforcement point. I mean, I guess particularly for DoD, right? A lot of people are pushing on the N-class side of DoD, which is still important, right? It's still stuff you don't want people to get access to, and you see people, moving to multi-tenancy environments. I'm just very worried about it. It's just
for someone like DoD, I think it's a different threat model. It's a different resource model. It's a different. So I think that's a very different scenario than if you pick like a mom and pop startup type thing,
Yeah.
So
it's the largest threat, but it's also like the lowest competence, So it's like, unfortunately, that's what it is, But the fact is, we're the biggest target, and you should expect us to have much better cybersecurity and talent than we do. And most people watch TV and like, oh, it's like NCIS where we push a button and we get access to all this stuff. That doesn't exist in real life. That's the opposite. You wait 5 years and you get the DNA report, So anyway, So yeah. All right. So let's move to the next step. So we talked a lot about zero trust, and you just mentioned the SDP side of the house. We talked about device enforcement. What pieces do you feel people forget about when you hear people talk about zero trust? And on the other side of that is I'm feeling people are using zero trust equal to cyber, and it's becoming so bloated, right? Everything is freaking zero trust.
Right.
Where do you put the line? Where does it stop, right? Because it cannot be everything cyber related things. That's just, then it's just cyber, right? So
I mean, yeah, we saw the same thing with DevOps, where it's like every old tool just
yeah,
got rebranded DevOps, and I think you're seeing
look
it
at
in
the CNCF landscape, right? I mean, it's just
cyber. It's the same thing. Everything in cyber, they put a new sticker on it and called it zero trust. But I think for us, the way I break it down is sort of, okay, to me, what does zero trust fundamentally mean, right? And I break it down into a few things, which is one is it's a move away from an implicit authentication or an authorization to it has to be explicit, meaning just because you're on my network doesn't mean you're authorized to anything. You have to have an explicit rule that says Armon as a member of this group has access to this system. And so I have to be authenticated as Armon, but I have to be authorized to access whatever the system is. Versus we live today in a world where like, oh, he's on the corporate network or he's on the VPN, so he has access. That implicit you have to get away from. The second piece of it is a fundamental approach towards least privilege, which is I shouldn't have access to anything unless I fundamentally need it to do my job, right? So closely related to that notion of explicit auth and auth Z is this notion of least privilege, right? So to me, those are the guiding principles of zero trust. Then it's like, how do I actualize it? How do I build a strategy around it? I think there's different views. Our view is it's fundamentally about identity. So it should be identity-based controls for everything, not IP-based, right? And so to do that, we think about the components as there's 4 pillars, right? It's human identity, which is, some IDP, right? Then number 2 is machine identity, right? Or application identity. We think of them as the same thing. And so it's like, how do I establish and manage that in a sane way? And then based on that, 3 is machine-to-machine access, right? So if App A is talking to App B, how do I govern that based on their identity? And the last is human-to-machine access, right? And that's closely related to SDP. So how do I do that, again, based on identity? To me, those are the 4 pillars. I think most people get the first one, the human identity one. And then I think people struggle to articulate what the other 3 are. I think a lot of people are like, my firewall vendor told me that the firewall is zero trust. And you're like,
right. Yeah, because it does identity, and just like the proxy aware stuff that just does basic identity management stuff for Ps. It's very common to as a proxy in front of stuff. So
exactly,
very very common stuff too. Yeah. And do you feel like a lot of people in DoD are pushing like the SIEM and SOAR capability to then push back and kind of effectively create a loop of the decision-making process, right? I feel like I'm not saying it doesn't bring a ton of cyber value, but I just feel like, okay, if you're going to start including the SIEM and SOAR and all this stuff in zero trust, it just becomes this massive thing. I'm not saying the decision, the policy should just be driven by static stuff, right? It could be dynamically created, but I just don't feel like the SIEM itself or the SOAR itself start becoming part of the, I mean, they're components, I guess, but I don't know. What do you think about that?
So, to me, it's like in some sense, the part of security that's never changed is you have 3 things you got to deal with: prevention of an attack, detection of an attack, mitigation of an attack, right? And so I think zero trust, a lot of the work I'm talking about around those 4 pillars is on the prevention. It's like, how do I architect the network to be low trust, secure, doing mutual TLS, all that kind of good stuff? That's really about prevention. The detection side of it then is around, I still need to have visibility to understand something is wrong. There's an actor doing things I shouldn't. And so that's where I think I put systems like the SIEMs, where it's really more about a detection than it is about anything else. And then mitigation is about, hey, you have sensible run books and a SOC, and you have do war game exercises and all that kind of good stuff. But so I think there's an important piece of like, you have that investment in the detection side of it as well. I think a SIEM is a part of that story. It doesn't have to be all of it. It doesn't even have to be the first thing you start with. But I think if you think about it as those 3 categories, like, what am I doing to prevent the breach? What am I doing to detect it if something does happen? And then do I have run books to mitigate it? And do I know what I'm doing?
Yeah, no doubt. So we have a couple of people that are asking questions kind of related to that before I move to my next questions. But Robert was saying machine identity will rely on MAC addresses being unique. How will you propose protecting counterfeit? Of course, we don't use Macs, so that's not a thing we even use. There's other ways to do it. Tell us how we actually do machine identity, because I want to make that clear. We don't use Mac. It's too easy to counterfeit. So
yeah, and this goes. Yeah, I should have said IP and MAC. I think about them as sort of network identifiers, but that's like we shouldn't trust IP addresses, and we shouldn't trust MAC addresses because they're forgeable, they're dynamic. You have all sorts of problems. So I think when we talk about establishing the application identity or the machine identity, you want things that are not forgeable. So it tends to be things like, certificates, right? So, PKI based solutions, or I have an HSM or a hardware root of trust module on the hardware device, where again, it tends to be a certificate based approach. There's a private key embedded in the HSM or the TPM. And I'm using a cryptographic approach and doing, something more like Diffie-Hellman to actually validate the identity of the device versus, hey, you came in on IP address, 1.2.3.4, therefore I trust you. So that's
even on the cloud, right? People now, like I think Amazon and others have this kind of TPM ability to go down to that level of access, right?
Yeah, and even if you're not using the TPMs, when you're in cloud, they're issuing short-lived signed certificates. So when you bring up an EC2 VM, Amazon is going to inject automatically an IAM token unique to that device or that VM or Lambda function. And that thing is cryptographically verifiable. So you can take that, make a call back to Amazon's API and say, I want to verify that this signature is valid and that the VM is what it says it is. And so you can do that kind of a closed loop cryptographic verification without trusting the IP address of the device. So yeah, I would say throw away the IP, throw away the MAC address, never think about those.
Yeah. And someone was asking kind of questions related, right? But it's kind of two questions that I can try to merge into one. When it comes to stolen equipment or equipment that usually used to enter a secure environment, and she was also mentioning how do you make sure is an ability for the product to know for sure that the hardware is what it's supposed to be, and I guess it ties back to what you just mentioned, right?
Exactly. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about with the multi-factor and all that kind of good stuff. So it's even if you stole one of the laptops, let's say, A, you'd need the hardware access key with you, which maybe it was still plugged in. But B, you still need to know what the username and password of the user was. So there's kind of multiple levels there where it's okay, even if you stole the device, what you probably ended up with was a useless brick, right? Because it's
right.
The hard disk is fully encrypted. The MDM is making sure everything is encrypted. So you probably can't even log in. To do anything with it, basically. And the moment someone reports it's stolen, we revoke the device trust and issue a remote wipe to the device.
Yeah, although most companies, unfortunately, are not there yet, but that's okay. They should.
Yeah. Right direction to go.
Yeah, that's kind of that should be an expected thing to do. And someone was asking if mutual TLS is kind of, I think of it as a mandated thing to get to SDP, but what do you think?
Yeah, I think mutual TLS is a big part of this. So when we talk about the system to system, right, with service mesh, whether it's Istio or Consul or other offerings, the core of those systems is mutual TLS, right? That's how they're pushing it out of the network, is we're saying, I don't trust my network. I'm going to do a explicit end-to-end TLS. Both sides are going to verify the identity. The identity is being authenticated, again, going back to auth-n with the PKI and the certificates, and then it's being authorized, going to auth-z, through the central control plane to say, yeah, app A and app B can talk. So there's a very critical role mutual TLS plays in that. Same thing, actually, when we talk about the human-to-machine access. If you're using a tool like Boundary, to the extent the systems support it, Boundary will do mutual TLS between basically the proxies and the endpoints, right? Because I don't want to trust my network, right? I want to push that up and do mutual TLS end-to-end. So yeah, mutual TLS plays a very important role, because I think otherwise, if you're not using any TLS, then what you're trusting is your network is high trust, confidential, and secure. Those are bad assumptions in a zero trust world.
Yeah. And someone was also asking about whether or not, using Microsoft AD can be used as an IDP. I mean, you mentioned you integrate with them. You don't see, any kind of IDP being less, enabling of adopting zero trust, right?
No, exactly. And going back to kind of that 4-pillar view, I think the first pillar with human identity, you can do it with LDAP, you can do it with Active Directory, pick your favorite. I think the key with that is a few things. One is a common user directory, right? So I don't want to have 10 of these things. And two is a cryptographic protocol that lets me validate this is Armon, he's a developer, he's a member of the organization. As long as it satisfies those requirements, whether you're using SAML or Kerberos or OIDC, it doesn't really matter. The protocol doesn't really matter. It's like you want a cryptographic protocol and you want a common user identity. That's the heart of it.
Yeah. So Mike was asking, identity-based controls for everything sounds great, but given the breadth of applications, don't we need standards for interoperability to avoid vendor lock-in, which, I'm always concerned about too in the government. So obviously, even to HashiCorp, right? That's not your best interest, but the fact is no one wants to get locked into companies.
Yeah, and I think the good news is, honestly, I think most of the standards are there, to be honest, right? Like if I talk about human identity, like I mentioned, OIDC, well understood standard protocol, SAML, well understood, public protocol. So human identity already pretty standardized. Then if I look at the sort of certificate formats we're using for mutual TLS, whether that's human to machine or machine to machine, basically everyone's using standard X509 TLS certificates. Identity is being encoded with sort of the spiffy kind of convention, right? Whether it's by Istio or Consul or the other meshes, everyone's kind of using the same spiffy standard. So
all the policy stuff, those the Sentinel stuff, and all those rules are pretty much locked into the control plane. That's a big one.
Actually, but if we look at even Sentinel, we've open sourced our specification. So the fact that other people haven't implemented it, they're welcome.
Yes. Well, for companies, although they can't think like that, right? It's if a standard is not adopted, it's not a standard, right? Because
and I think OPA is a good example. Like it has some broad reach and multiple standards. So again, for us, we're going to support both the OPA language and Sentinel. Sentinel, the language is open source and it's a public spec. So I don't see because
you see all these CLDs, right, in YAML and stuff that people dismiss as no big deal, but it's a massive lock-in when you start doing granular whitelisting of hundreds of thousands of services. You could do some ETL and transform it, but it's just it's a nightmare.
It is. I think at the end of the day, there's some element of like some amount of lock-in no matter what, right? I think it's like you need to have points of flexibility to enable a migration, and I think those are there, whether it's OIDC or TLS or whatever. But there's always going to be something specific about the way you manage user groups, and Active Directory will be slightly different than the way you manage it in some other system, right? And the way you define policy in Sentinel is a good example, will be slightly different than how you do it in some other tool. But at the end of the day, it's like, is it so much lock-in that you couldn't conceivably move, or like there's going to be some friction, but it's possible to migrate? And I think the reality is like it'll be possible to migrate. I don't think it's ever possible to make it frictionless, because otherwise it's like you're not really adding any value. It's lowest common denominator.
Right. It's just commodity. Yeah, it's true. It's a balance. But I can tell you, the government, the smallest pain creates a massive lock-in, because no one is going to move off of it ever. So the companies will have the motivation to do it, but the government is just any kind of pain. You're going to see someone still using the stuff 50 years from now. So I guess Mike was also asking, and I want to give you a chance to answer that, right? Because you did mention that you open source at least the format, right? Sentinel is an enterprise feature of HashiCorp Consul, Nomad, and Terraform and Vault. So I guess he was saying one big difference between OPA and Sentinel is closed source. I guess it's true that Sentinel as a product is closed source, right? But you did open source at least the what is it, the
language? Yeah, exactly.
Language.
So that's kind of how we think about like the language versus the engine as being kind of these two different things, right? We kind of talk about
What pushed you not to open source the whole thing? I guess because it's too fancy.
Part of it was just goes back to our model of how we commercialize, right? Our view is the open source is very much, and we're not apologetic about it. Hey, open source should solve practitioner problems, small business, you're kind of getting started, but our commercial product's designed to solve the problems of the largest, global enterprises and public organizations. And those organizations, like, by the time you're implementing a security and compliance team, like you look like one of those.
All right. Yeah.
So I think fair. Unfortunately, I can't pay my developers with GitHub stars. So at some point, something has to
be
not?
You can't do that. I thought I thought that was a good way to do it. Honestly, most open source companies are not open source companies. Let's be clear. They have massive enterprise features. They play to be open source, but then you start looking at the details and you find that all the identity, RBAC, ABAC, LBAC, FIPS compliant crypto is always in the closed source bits, and they kind of hide it. I just hate it. At least with you guys, it's just a more transparent thing. I just like that better than people that pretend to be open source, and then every time you want something, that's kind of a expected feature nowadays to support RBAC. I mean, come on,
Right.
don't people say, oh, that's an enterprise feature. I'm like, really? Like roles is an enterprise feature, and you want to do zero trust now? Okay, tell me how you do that again. So anyway, it's just ridiculous, but I get it. All right, so my last questions to you before we let you. So every time when we end the show, we always let the guests, give their final words. So I'm gonna ask you one more question, and then we probably have one more question from the public here. So time to ask it. I have a few lined up that I'm gonna pick from, and then parting words. Before that, I'm gonna remind people who is the next guest on the show, and then I'll give it over to you. So, but I wanted to ask you because your journey is pretty incredible. How old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
31.
31. So you're younger than me. I created my company. I was 15. When did you create? How old were you when you created the company?
22 when I started HashiCorp.
22. So you were 7 years older than me, which is pretty good. And so how did you get there? Right? What are your lessons learned as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I mean, it's so again, this one goes back to like I could write a book. In some sense, I think the thing that served me and Mitchell the most was being, frankly, humble about our shortcomings, and I think making the early decision to bring on senior leaders who have sort of been there, done that. So I think it's kind of controversial, but a lot of founders never bring in an outside CEO. Me and Mitchell made that decision early on. We brought in Dave McJannet, who's been our CEO since 2016. He's a great partner to us. And I think what he brought with him was a wealth of experience, right? He had worked at a number of enterprise companies. He'd taken multiple companies IPO. So he'd sort of been around the block in terms of understanding open source, enterprise, how to build a business, how to, really commercialize an idea, not just, hack around with open source. And so I think we were sort of made that decision early on to say, what are our shortcomings? And can we hire people who are way better than us at those things, right? Because that's what's going to help the business succeed. And so I think ultimately it's coming back and asking yourself, what's more important to you? Is it important that you have the title of CEO, or is it more important that HashiCorp, the company, succeed, right? And I think for us, it was more important that the company succeed. My title could be whatever it wants to be. I could be chief janitorial officer. I don't care. It's about making the products and the company and the ideas successful. That's what motivated us. And so I think that was probably one of the biggest, because I think early on we brought in, heads of sales, marketing, CEO, et cetera, and let them take over big parts of the company. So I think that was a really important part of it. I think the second part of it was just you end up realizing that startups are not a 9 to 5, right? I think I've seen a lot of people who go into thinking like it's a lifestyle, and you're like, no, it's not.
Right.
It's 7 days a week. It's 10, 12-hour days, and I think some people thrive under those conditions and other people don't, right? And I think you have to go in really open-minded on like have the right expectations and know what your motivations are. Because I think I've seen a lot of friends who have sort of gone in and tried founding and realized like maybe their motivations aren't aligned, or it's not the life. They wanted a 9 to 5 job and discovered it's not a 9 to 5 job.
Well, I can tell you, most people are not entrepreneurs, whether or not they want to pretend. That's not a thing. That's why no one is the same, and there's different priorities in life. And I think I remember my first 20 years, I think I took 57 days of vacation from 15 to, whatever, 32 or whatever. So 57 days of vacation, working, like you said, 12-hour days. So,
exactly. But I think that's what it takes, right? That's what it takes. And I think
it's the passion behind it. I think it's beyond that, right? I think the one thing you didn't mention is I was always very passionate of IT. A lot of people nowadays got into IT because of the money, and not because of the passion. Back when we started, at least when I started, that wasn't a money thing. Money was kind of a side effect, but That's
Right.
if you have the passion, you don't feel the pain of the 12 hours. You know what I mean?
Or at least you feel it, but it lets you power through because you're like, you care about
Right.
getting to the other side.
Yeah, you feel it. You always feel it, but it's not as painful, I guess. Yeah.
No, I
So we
think
did take a lot of questions from the public, but I'm going to take one more and then before I let you go. All right. So, what are your thoughts on human identity, app identity, data identity, and can this anchor a deeper algorithmic understanding of the machine learning from the data to extricate that value tied to the usage of the application, especially using Consul to federate the service mesh? That's a very smart question, but
yeah,
I
exactly.
couldn't read it.
Let me tease it out because I think there's actually multiple layers to this, and I think it's a great question, which is, yes, I think that the identity-based approach, you can extend it to all of those things, right? Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking about human and app. I think data is a natural extension of how do I apply identity-based policy to data governance. So yes, absolutely. Now the question of like, how do you actually do that is an interesting one. And I think this is actually where, this is not a HashiCorp shaped problem, but maybe an entrepreneur out there wants to solve it, is I think the existing data management systems we have are not designed for the task. And what I mean by that is, if you think about a VPN, it was designed to give you all or nothing access to a network. When you think about most databases, they're designed to give you all or nothing access to data, right? I log into MySQL, as long as I have the username and password, great, I can do anything I want in that database. And so they were built in this different era of high trust, in the same way our networks were built in a different era of high trust. Yeah. And so I think there's an opportunity to rethink the actual data management systems so you can push that granular identity-based controls all the way down into the data systems themselves. And I think you see a bunch of neat startups in this space that are looking at exactly that, of doing row level, column level security tied to identity and access control. But I think you need a next generation of database to do that. You're not going to do that with, Oracle database.
The first one that did that was the intelligence community was the first one to really do at massive scale, both structured and unstructured data, the granular access control down to the cell level. They were the first one. So, the government is not completely useless. So they did that pretty good, but it never really became mainstream.
They had the right motivations, right? I mean, given their problem,
right.
You have a ton of users. You can't trust all of them. You have a ton of data. And so that becomes the right answers. You have to have that cell level granularity. And I think the rest of industry didn't have that problem, didn't have the shape of the problem. And so those commercial solutions never got built. But I think everyone's now realizing that actually we all have that problem.
Yeah. And we have tons of classification levels and overclassification and, so compounds. It's not just user, it's that the data has so many labels and things. And so I guess granular labeling will be a thing now, which, a lot of companies starting to work it, it's getting there.
Exactly.
All right. So, wanted to thank you, of course, for joining the show. I'm going to remind everybody that next week, Tuesday, 1 p.m., we're going to get a great guest. For people that know the DoD, he's been a great friend and long-time partner to get things done in the department. Joy Aurora is going to join us. He's now the VP of Growth at the Outpost, which helps companies do business with DoD and get access to government funding and mechanisms to get funded, both in SBIRs and other mechanisms. Is also, a reservist, and before that he was at Platform One, and he also founded AppWorks, and is a just awesome person to talk to when it comes to getting companies to work for the government. With the government and turn them into billion-dollar opportunities. So it's going to be a lot of fun, more business-centric than tech stuff, but that's also good to move away a little bit from the tech. So over to you for the last words, and I wanted to thank everybody again for joining.
Yeah, just going to say thanks so much for having me. It was great to talk. I know we went on kind of a broad range of stuff, so always happy to chat all things cyber and cloud, and appreciate you making the time. And yeah, if folks have any questions, I'm easy to find on the internet, so feel free to reach out. All
right. Well, thanks so much again for the time. This was a lot of fun, and so many people learned a lot. I learned a lot, so this was great. Thanks for taking the time, and everybody keep fighting the good fight. Make sure we have a fighting chance at winning against China 20 years from now for our kids, and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thanks.